The crystal stemware trembled against white linen as Zara Williams balanced another tray of premium soju, her trained eyes automatically cataloging the tension that crackled through Han Nul's dining room like electricity before a storm. 3 years of working tables in this upscale Korean restaurant had taught her to read dangerous men the way she once read patient monitors, and tonight every instinct screamed that violence was coming. She moved with practiced grace between tables where conversations died when she approached, serving men who spoke in careful whispers and never quite relaxed their shoulders. The restaurant's elegant interior, all dark wood and traditional screens, felt more like a battlefield tonight than the sanctuary of authentic cuisine it pretended to be during daylight hours. Her medical training, dormant but never forgotten, kicked in as she observed the subtle signs. Elevated respiratory rates, micro-expressions of fear masked by bravado, the way hands hovered near jacket pockets with telltale bulges. These men were preparing for war, and she was serving dinner in the middle of it. Whether you're watching this from Seoul, Atlanta, or anywhere between, you know that feeling when you walk into a room and sense danger hanging in the air like smoke. At the center table sat the man who commanded every other presence in the room through sheer gravitational force. Jun Hyunwoo possessed the kind of stillness that spoke of absolute control, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection over a frame that suggested both elegance and lethal capability. When he lifted his glass, every other movement in the restaurant seemed to pause in deference. His dark eyes tracked every entrance, every server, every shadow with the precision of a predator who had survived by never missing a threat. Zara had served him before, always maintaining the professional distance that kept servers invisible to men like him. She knew his preference for Wayo 41 neat, his habit of positioning himself with clear sight lines to all exits, the way his voice could drop to a whisper and still command absolute attention from men twice his size. She also knew that beneath the expensive cologne and perfectly styled hair lived something ancient and dangerous. Tonight felt different. The usual lieutenants flanked him with visible tension, their suits unable to disguise the weapons they carried like other men carried wallets. Conversations died mid-sentence when strangers entered. The kitchen staff moved with nervous efficiency, and even the veteran servers avoided making direct eye contact with patrons. Zara approached his table with a measured confidence that had once carried her through trauma bays during her residency, before everything collapsed. Her movements remained fluid despite the hypervigilance that made her skin feel electric. She set down his drink with steady hands, noting how his fingers brushed the glass with the same controlled precision he applied to everything else. The attack came without warning. Smoke canisters shattered through the front windows in a symphony of breaking glass and hissing gas. The elegant dining room transformed into chaos as thick yellow vapor billowed across the space, carrying the acrid stench of industrial chemicals. Men shouted in Korean and English. Chairs crashed as bodies hit the floor, and somewhere in the poisonous haze came the distinctive sound of weapons being drawn. Zara's medical training overrode everything else. The smell hit her first, metallic and wrong, triggering memories of chemical exposure protocols from her emergency medicine rotation. Chlorine gas mixed with something else, something designed to incapacitate rather than kill immediately. Her lungs burned as she dropped low, using techniques learned in disaster response training to minimize exposure while maintaining mobility. Through the chaos, she heard him before she saw him. Jun's controlled voice had become a rasp, each breath a struggle against lungs that refused to function properly. His lieutenants stumbled blindly through the toxic cloud, their expensive suits and dangerous reputations useless against an enemy they couldn't fight or intimidate. She found him collapsed against the overturned table, his perfect composure finally cracked. Sweat beaded his forehead as his body he fought against respiratory failure. And for the first time since she'd known him, Jun Hyunwoo looked vulnerable. His dark eyes found hers through the dissipating gas, and she saw something she'd never seen before in those depths. Fear. His hand shot out with desperate strength, fingers closing around her wrist with a grip that would leave bruises. The man who commanded with whispers was reduced to a breathless plea that cut through the chaos like a blade. "Please save me." The words hung between them as his breathing became increasingly labored, his normally steady pulse racing beneath skin growing pale and clammy. Around them, his organization crumbled into panic while their leader fought for each breath, his grip on her wrist the only thing anchoring him to consciousness. Zara felt time slow as her medical instincts warred with common sense, knowing that the choice she made in the next few seconds would change everything. Zara's hands moved with surgical precision as she dropped to her knees beside June's failing form, her mind automatically shifting into the clinical focus that had once made her one of Atlanta's most promising trauma surgeons. The chaos around them faded to background noise as she assessed his condition with practiced efficiency, noting the cyanosis creeping across his lips and the rapid, shallow breathing that indicated severe respiratory distress. "Move back," she commanded his stunned lieutenants, her voice carrying an authority that cut through their panic. "All of you, create a perimeter. No one approaches without my permission." The men who moments before had been prepared to die for their leader now found themselves taking orders from a waitress, but something in her tone brooked no argument. She positioned June's airway with movements that spoke of years spent in trauma bays, her fingers finding his pulse point while mentally calculating respiratory rates and oxygen saturation levels. "I need clean water, towels, and someone to call emergency services," she directed, already working to clear his airway of the chemical residue that threatened to close his throat completely. Her hands remained steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting, muscle memory from countless emergency procedures guiding her movements. The gas was designed to incapacitate rather than kill outright, a calculated attack meant to leave June vulnerable rather than dead. Chlorine mixed with an industrial irritant, probably deployed by someone who understood enough chemistry to create maximum respiratory distress without immediate fatality. As she worked, Zara found herself mentally cataloging treatment protocols she hadn't accessed in 3 years. "Dr. Williams, what the hell happened to your career?" The question that had haunted her since the malpractice lawsuit echoed in her mind as she fought to save a man whose world operated by rules she'd never imagined. 3 years ago, she'd been chief resident in emergency medicine at Grady Hospital, fielding the worst trauma cases Atlanta could produce. Now she served Korean businessmen who carried guns and spoke in codes she didn't want to understand. The lawsuit had destroyed everything. One patient, one split-second decision during a mass casualty event, one family with enough money and rage to pursue her through every court in Georgia. Medical malpractice, they'd claimed. Gross negligence resulting in wrongful death. The settlement had bankrupted her, and the medical board's investigation had left her license suspended indefinitely pending review that never seemed to come. She'd fled to this job because it required no background checks, no references, no explanations about why a former surgeon was serving tables. The restaurant's clientele appreciated servers who minded their own business and asked no questions, making it the perfect place for someone who needed to disappear. June's breathing began to stabilize under her ministrations, the blue tinge fading from his lips as his airway cleared. She monitored his pulse, noting the gradual return to normal rhythm as his body fought off the worst effects of the exposure. Around them, his men maintained the perimeter she'd ordered, their respect for her growing with each steady breath their leader took. His eyes opened slowly, focusing on her face with an intensity that made her acutely aware of how close she knelt to him. For a moment, neither spoke as he processed what had happened, his analytical mind clearly working to understand how a restaurant server had possessed the skills to save his life. "You are not what you appear to be," he said finally, his voice still rough but gaining strength. Zara helped him sit up slowly, continuing to monitor his breathing while avoiding his penetrating stare. "Sometimes appearances are all we have," she replied, already regretting how much her actions had revealed about her hidden past. Within hours, his investigation into her background was complete. Min-jun, his most trusted lieutenant, presented the findings with the thoroughness that made Jun's organization so effective. Zara Williams, former chief resident in emergency medicine, medical degree from Emory, surgical training at Grady Hospital, license suspended following malpractice lawsuit, financial assets frozen, currently working under an assumed identity to avoid creditors and legal proceedings. The file contained everything: her medical achievements, the lawsuit details, even photographs from her residency graduation. Jun studied each page with the same methodical attention he applied to business contracts, understanding that he now possessed complete leverage over the woman who had saved his life. He found her in the restaurant's break room hours later, still wearing the uniform stained with his blood and the chemical residue from the attack. She looked exhausted, her professional composure finally cracking under the weight of what had transpired. When he entered, she straightened automatically but couldn't quite meet his eyes. "Dr. Williams," he said quietly, using her former title deliberately. "We need to discuss your situation." "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, but the words lacked conviction. Jun placed the investigation file on the table between them, watching as recognition and resignation flickered across her features. "Your enemies are still looking for you. The lawsuit may be settled, but the board investigation continues. Certain parties would pay handsomely for information about your current location and activities." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. He could destroy what little remained of her life with a single phone call, exposing her hiding place to creditors and investigators who would drag her back to Atlanta to face the wreckage of her former career. "However," he continued, his tone shifting to something that might have been genuine concern, "you have skills I require. Tonight proved that my usual medical resources are insufficient for the threats I face. I am offering you a position, not as a server, but as what you truly are: a doctor." The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Exclusive medical services for his organization in exchange for protection from her legal troubles. A private suite in his compound, full access to medical equipment and supplies, and most importantly, the security that came with being under his personal protection. Your choice is between hiding in plain sight until your enemies find you, or accepting the protection of someone with the resources to ensure they never do, he explained with the matter-of-fact tone he might use to discuss a business merger. Zara stared at the file containing her destroyed life, understanding that he was offering her something she'd thought impossible: a return to medicine, even if practiced in shadows and secrecy. The chance to use her skills again, to save lives rather than serve drinks to men who took them. The compound would be luxurious but controlled, her movements monitored and her freedom conditional. She would trade one form of hiding for another, exchanging invisibility for gilded captivity. But the alternative was eventual discovery and a return to legal battles she lacked the resources to fight. "I would be your personal physician," she said carefully, testing the boundaries of his offer. "Among other things," he replied, and something in his voice suggested that the position would evolve beyond simple medical care. "You would be under my direct protection, which means your safety becomes my responsibility and your actions become my concern." The cage he offered was beautiful and secure, but it remained a cage nonetheless. Yet as she considered her alternatives, Zara realized that accepting Jun's protection might be the only way to survive long enough to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. She looked up to find him watching her with patience that spoke of absolute confidence in her eventual acceptance. In his eyes, she saw not the gratitude of a man whose life she'd saved, but the calculated interest of someone who had found exactly what he'd been searching for without knowing he needed it. "When do I start?" she asked, the words sealing a contract that would bind them together in ways neither yet understood. "Tomorrow," he replied simply, and she realized her life as Zara the waitress had just ended forever. The compound sprawled across 15 acres of manicured grounds, its modern architecture disguising defensive features that spoke of a man who understood the price of power. Zara's private suite occupied the third floor of the main house, complete with panoramic windows that offered stunning views of the city while remaining bulletproof barriers against the outside world. Everything spoke of wealth carefully deployed to create beauty that could withstand violence. Her medical facility exceeded anything she'd worked with during her residency. State-of-the-art surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that would stock a small hospital, and diagnostic tools that represented millions of dollars in investment. June had spared no expense in creating a space where she could practice medicine at the highest level, even if her patients would be men who lived outside the law. The challenge came not from the equipment, but from the culture. His organization operated on rigid hierarchy and unquestioned loyalty, concepts that clashed directly with medical protocols requiring autonomous decision-making and patient advocacy. When she established triage procedures that prioritized medical need over organizational rank, several lieutenants bristled at the suggestion that their status meant nothing in her treatment room. Medical emergencies do not respect chain of command. She explained to him in June after he questioned why she'd treated a low-ranking associate before addressing his supervisor's minor injury. In this room, I'm the final authority on all medical decisions. The confrontation reached June within hours, as she'd known it would. He appeared in her clinic during evening rounds, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere as his men straightened with automatic deference. She continued checking her patient's wound closure, refusing to allow his arrival to interrupt her professional routine. "I understand you are establishing new protocols," he said quietly, positioning himself where she could see him without having to stop her work. "I am establishing medical protocols," she corrected, applying fresh dressing with practiced efficiency. "If someone requires emergency surgery, they receive it regardless of their position in your organization. If you find that unacceptable, I suggest you hire a veterinarian instead of a doctor." His soft laugh surprised her, and when she glanced up, she saw genuine amusement rather than the cold displeasure she'd expected. "You do not compromise easily, Dr. Williams. Not when lives are at stake," she replied, noting how he used her professional title with a respect his men hadn't yet learned. Over the following weeks, she treated gunshot wounds, knife injuries, and the occasional casualty from territorial disputes she didn't want to understand. Her competence earned grudging respect from men who'd initially dismissed her as June's latest acquisition. They began requesting her specifically for medical needs, trusting her steady hands and clinical judgment over the back-alley physicians they'd previously relied upon. The breakthrough came when she successfully performed emergency surgery on a young associate who'd taken a bullet near his spine. Working for 6 hours with only basic equipment, she managed to extract the projectile without causing paralysis, saving both his mobility and his life. Word of the surgery spread through the organization like wildfire, cementing her reputation as someone worthy of the protection June provided. Late one evening, she found June in his private study, reviewing financial reports with the methodical focus she'd come to associate with his approach to business. A cut above his left eyebrow had reopened during the day, blood seeping through the butterfly bandage he'd applied himself rather than seeking proper medical attention. "That needs cleaning and proper sutures," she said from the doorway, her tone carrying the authority she'd learned to project when treating stubborn patients. He looked up with mild surprise, as if he'd forgotten about the injury entirely. "It is nothing worth your concern. Everything medical in this compound is my concern," she replied, already retrieving supplies from the kit she'd learned to carry everywhere. "Sit still and let me work." The intimacy of treating him caught her off guard. Cleaning the wound required her to stand close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his skin, close enough to catch the subtle scent of sandalwood, and something uniquely him that made her pulse quicken despite her professional detachment. As she worked, her fingers traced the edges of older scars that spoke of a violent history he'd never discussed. "You have seen significant trauma," she observed, noting the precise placement of what appeared to be knife wounds across his shoulder and upper chest. "Occupational hazards," he replied quietly, but something in his voice suggested deeper stories behind each mark. Her touch seemed to affect him as much as their proximity affected her. His breathing shifted subtly as she worked, and she felt the tension in his muscles gradually ease under her careful ministrations. When she finished the sutures, neither moved away immediately. The space between them charged with awareness neither had acknowledged aloud. The nightmare came 3 weeks into her residence, jerking her awake with the familiar terror that had haunted her sleep since the lawsuit. In her dreams, she was back in the trauma bay, facing the decision that had destroyed her career. A child with massive internal bleeding, multiple victims from a school bus accident, and insufficient resources to save everyone. The choice that had seemed medically sound in the moment, but had been dissected by lawyers until it appeared criminally negligent. She woke, gasping, her heart racing as phantom voices accused her of playing God with children's lives. The familiar shame and self-doubt flooded back, along with the crushing weight of knowing that one split-second decision had negated years of training and dedication. A soft knock at her door surprised her. She found June in the hallway, fully dressed despite the late hour, his expression showing concern that seemed genuinely personal rather than simply protective. "I heard you cry out," he said simply. "Are you hurt?" The kindness in his voice nearly undid her composure entirely. "Just a nightmare," she replied, trying to project strength she didn't feel. He studied her face with the same intensity he applied to business problems, clearly seeing through her attempt to minimize what had happened. "Would you like to talk about it?" The offer surprised her more than his presence. In the weeks she'd lived in his compound, their conversations had remained professional, focused on medical needs and organizational protocols. This was the first time he'd offered personal comfort rather than simply ensuring her physical safety. They ended up in his private kitchen, an unexpectedly domestic space that contrasted sharply with the formal areas where he conducted business. He prepared tea with careful precision while she found herself explaining the night that had changed everything. The bus accident, the impossible choices, the lawsuit that had painted her as a villain rather than a doctor who tried to save lives under impossible circumstances. "You made the best decision possible with the information available," he said when she finished, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "The alternative would have resulted in multiple deaths rather than one." "The lawyers disagreed," she replied, surprised by how much his confidence meant to her. "Lawyers are paid to create narrative, not to understand medicine or crisis decision-making," he said quietly. "I have made similar choices under pressure. The burden of responsibility for life and death decisions is one few people can understand." Something in his tone suggested personal experience with impossible choices, and she realized that despite their different worlds, they shared the weight of decisions that haunted them both. The conversation stretched past midnight, covering topics of duty, honor, and the sacrifices required by their respective responsibilities. As dawn approached, she found herself seeing him not as the dangerous man who controlled her circumstances, but as someone who understood the isolation that came with bearing responsibility for others' lives. The attraction that had been building since her arrival intensified into something deeper, more complicated than simple physical awareness. The reminder of her ongoing vulnerability came through the morning news 3 days later. An investigative report about medical malpractice cases included footage from her trial, her face prominently displayed as an example of physicians who'd escaped justice through legal technicalities. The reporter mentioned that Dr. Zara Williams remained under investigation, with authorities seeking her current whereabouts for additional questioning. June found her staring at the television screen in his study, her face pale as she processed the implications of renewed public attention to her case. The segment had provided enough details for anyone motivated to locate her, and she realized her sanctuary might not be as secure as she believed. "They cannot reach you here," he said quietly, positioning himself where she could see his certainty rather than the fear that had frozen her in place. "You cannot protect me from everyone," she replied, voicing the concern that had haunted her since accepting his arrangement. His response surprised her with its intensity. "I can, and I will protect you from anyone who threatens you, Zara." That is not a conditional promise. The use of her first name, spoken with quiet determination, sent warmth through her chest even as she recognized the implications. His protection was becoming personal rather than simply contractual, and she was beginning to depend on his strength in ways that went far beyond physical safety. Later that evening, she challenged the boundaries of their arrangement directly. "I need to leave the compound for medical supplies that cannot be delivered here," she informed him during their daily briefing. His immediate tension was visible, his protective instincts clearly warring with respect for her professional judgment. "What supplies specifically?" "Specialized surgical equipment for the procedure I am planning next week," she replied. "Equipment that requires Hansen selection and cannot be ordered blindly." "I will send Minjun with a list of specifications," he offered, but she shook her head. "I need to evaluate the options personally. This is not negotiable from a medical standpoint." The argument that followed revealed the fundamental tension in their arrangement. His need to control her environment for security purposes conflicted with her need for professional autonomy, creating friction that neither had fully anticipated. Eventually, he agreed to accompany her personally, a compromise that satisfied his security concerns while acknowledging her medical authority. As she prepared for bed that night, Zara realized that their relationship was evolving beyond the simple contract they'd originally negotiated. What had begun as mutual necessity was becoming something more complex, more personal, and infinitely more dangerous to the emotional walls they'd both constructed around their wounded hearts. The alarm pierced the pre-dawn quiet with urgent intensity, jolting Zara from sleep as emergency sirens wailed across the city beyond the compound walls. From her window, she could see the orange glow painting the horizon where an industrial facility burned against the dark sky, thick smoke billowing into the morning air in patterns that spoke of chemical disaster rather than simple fire. Her phone buzzed with emergency alerts. "Chemical spill at Hanwha processing plant. Evacuate 3-mile radius. Seek immediate medical attention for respiratory distress, skin irritation, or nausea." The facility was less than 2 miles from the compound, close enough that the acrid smell was already seeping through the building's advanced filtration systems. She dressed quickly in scrubs she'd acquired for emergency situations, her medical instincts overriding everything else as she processed the magnitude of what was happening. A chemical plant explosion meant mass casualties, overwhelmed emergency services, and victims who would need immediate treatment to survive the next few hours. Every minute of delay would cost lives. June appeared in the hallway as she emerged from her suite, already fully dressed despite the early hour. His expression showed the controlled alertness she'd learned to associate with crisis management, but when his eyes fixed on her medical bag, his features hardened. "You are not leaving this compound," he said with quiet authority. "The area is contaminated and unstable. People are dying out there," she replied, moving toward the stairs with purposeful strides. "I am the only trauma surgeon within miles of that disaster." His hand closed gently but firmly around her arm, stopping her progress without causing pain. "My responsibility is your safety, not the welfare of strangers." The argument that followed revealed the fundamental difference in their worldviews. For June, loyalty operated in concentric circles with her safety at the absolute center, making the suffering of outsiders irrelevant compared to protecting what belonged to him. For Zara, medical ethics demanded that she respond to mass casualties regardless of personal risk or political complications. "I did not become a doctor to hide in luxury while people suffer," she said, meeting his gaze with determination that matched his own. "If you want to stop me, you'll have to physically restrain me." Something flickered in his eyes at her direct challenge, and she realized she'd pushed beyond the boundaries of their carefully negotiated arrangement into territory where his control met her moral conviction. For a long moment, neither spoke as they measured each other's resolve. The sound of helicopters overhead broke the standoff. Through the windows, they could see medical evacuation aircraft heading toward the disaster site, their presence confirming the severity of the situation. Zara used the distraction to step past him, knowing that every second of debate meant more casualties. "If you insist on this reckless action, you will not go alone," he said finally, his voice carrying resigned determination. "My security team will establish a perimeter while you work." The temporary medical station had been established in a school gymnasium 3 miles from the plant, far enough to be safe from ongoing contamination, but close enough for ambulances to transport the worst cases. Zara arrived to find chaos barely contained by overwhelmed medical staff, with victims arriving faster than they could be properly triaged or treated. She immediately took charge of the most critical cases, her surgical training allowing her to assess and stabilize patients with efficiency that transformed the chaotic space into something resembling organized medical care. June's security team established a protective perimeter as promised, but she quickly forgot about their presence as the urgency of medical crisis consumed her attention. The victims told a story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary disaster. A mother holding her burned child, begging anyone who would listen to save her baby. An elderly man struggling to breathe through lungs seared by chemical exposure. Teenagers who'd been walking to school when the explosion turned their world into a toxic nightmare. Working on the children proved most difficult. Their smaller bodies made them more vulnerable to chemical exposure, requiring delicate calculations of medication dosages and fluid replacement that demanded absolute precision. As she intubated a 6-year-old girl whose airway was closing from chemical burns, Zara felt the familiar focus that had made her exceptional in trauma medicine, the state where time slowed and every movement carried life or death significance. June watched from the perimeter his men had established, initially monitoring for external threats, but gradually becoming fixated on observing Zara work. He saw her comfort a terrified mother in broken Korean, while simultaneously directing the insertion of chest tubes to relieve pneumothorax. He witnessed her spend 20 minutes with an elderly woman who was dying, holding her hand and speaking softly until her breathing finally stopped. What struck him most profoundly was her complete lack of discrimination. She treated everyone with the same fierce dedication, from wealthy business owners to undocumented workers, from Korean nationals to foreign residents. In her hands, every life carried identical value regardless of social status or political importance, a concept that challenged his carefully constructed understanding of how the world operated. The breakthrough moment came when she successfully resuscitated a young father whose heart had stopped from chemical exposure. Working for nearly 30 minutes with manual compressions and carefully administered medications, she brought him back from clinical death while his wife and children watched from behind the medical barriers. When his pulse returned and his breathing stabilized, the family's tears of gratitude were echoed by cheers from other victims who had witnessed the resurrection. June felt something shift inside his chest as he watched her accept the family's thanks with quiet professionalism before immediately moving to the next critical patient. In that moment, he understood that what he'd initially seen as reckless defiance was actually the purest expression of her fundamental nature. She was not challenging his authority for its own sake, but responding to a calling that transcended any earthly power structure. As the immediate crisis stabilized and additional medical personnel arrived, Zara finally allowed herself a brief respite. She found June waiting by the evacuation vehicles, his expression unreadable as she approached with exhaustion weighing down her steps. "You saved 17 lives today," he said quietly, the precise number indicating he'd been keeping careful count. "I lost 3, she replied, the failures weighing more heavily than the successes in her mind. 3 who would have died regardless," he corrected gently. 17 who lived because you defied my orders." The admission surprised her, but not as much as the pride she heard in his voice. During the drive back to the compound, he spoke little, seemingly lost in thoughts she couldn't read. It wasn't until they reached the privacy of his study that he revealed what the day had cost him emotionally. "Chemical weapons killed my family," he said without preamble, the words delivered with controlled precision that barely contained deeper pain. "My parents, my younger sister, my grandparents. A rival organization contaminated their water supply with industrial toxins, then watched them die slowly over 3 weeks. The confession explained his violent reaction to her insistence on responding to chemical disaster, and she realized that his control over her movements came not from mere possessiveness, but from terror of losing someone else to the same fate that had destroyed his childhood. I was 15, studying in America when it happened. He continued, his voice carrying the weight of guilt and powerlessness that had shaped him. By the time I returned, they were all dead, and I learned that safety is an illusion unless you have the power to enforce it absolutely. Zara felt her understanding of him shift fundamentally as she processed the magnitude of loss that had forged his worldview. His need to control her environment wasn't about dominance, but about preventing the helpless watching while poison claimed someone he'd begun to care for more than he'd intended. "I am sorry," she said quietly, the words insufficient for such profound loss, but carrying genuine empathy for the boy who'd lost everything to chemical warfare. "Today, I watched you walk willingly into the same type of disaster that killed them," he said, meeting her eyes with vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I realized that trying to cage you would destroy the very essence of what makes you who you are." The shift in power dynamic was subtle but unmistakable. He was acknowledging her autonomy not as a concession to her demands, but as recognition that her compassionate nature was precisely what made her invaluable to him. Protecting her meant preserving her ability to act according to her medical ethics, even when those actions terrified him. "You could have ordered your men to stop me," she observed. "I considered it," he admitted with something that might have been a smile. "Then I realized I would rather live in fear of losing you than face the certainty of destroying who you are." As they sat in his study, sharing the quiet intimacy of mutual understanding, Zara recognized that their relationship had evolved beyond the contractual arrangement they'd originally negotiated. What had begun as forced proximity was becoming genuine partnership, built on respect for each other's fundamental nature rather than simple mutual necessity. When she finally retired to her suite that night, it was with the knowledge that she'd chosen to return to the compound not because she had no alternatives, but because she was beginning to trust that June's protection came from genuine care rather than mere possession. The distinction made all the difference between captivity and sanctuary, between being trapped and being treasured. The surveillance footage arrived at dawn, delivered to June's compound through channels that bypassed every security protocol he'd established. 20 minutes of grainy video showing Zara's daily routines, her medical supply runs, her preferred routes through the city. The message was unmistakable. "We have been watching. We know her vulnerabilities, and your protection means nothing." Lee Song-min's organization had finally made their move after months of careful observation. The rival syndicate leader had built his reputation on psychological warfare, understanding that the most effective way to destroy a powerful man was to target what he valued most. The video represented weeks of surveillance, proving they'd been studying Zara's movements with the patience of predators selecting their prey. "Your doctor has become a liability," Minjun observed quietly as they reviewed the footage for the third time. "They will use her against you." June's response was immediate and absolute. "Double her security detail. No medical runs without full escort. She does not leave the compound without my explicit approval." But when he presented the new restrictions to Zara that morning, her reaction was everything he'd feared. The independent woman who defied him to save strangers would not accept being imprisoned, even for her own protection. "I have patients who depend on these supply runs," she said firmly, reviewing her schedule with the same professional focus she applied to medical procedures. Canceling them is not an option. The argument escalated quickly, with June's protective instincts warring against her medical obligations. She needed specialized equipment for the cardiac surgery plan for the following week, supplies that required personal evaluation and could not be ordered blindly. He needed her safe behind the compound's walls, protected by security systems that had taken years to perfect. The compromise they reached satisfied neither, but represented mutual trust hard-won through shared vulnerability. She would conduct the supply run with enhanced security, accompanied by his most trusted operators in reinforced vehicles using varied routes to prevent ambush. The medical facility would be contacted in advance, the visit carefully choreographed to minimize exposure time. What neither anticipated was Lee Songmin's willingness to sacrifice his own people to achieve his objectives. The attack came at the medical supply warehouse, a sterile facility in an industrial district where June's security team had conducted advanced sweeps. The building appeared secure, the loading areas clear, every protocol satisfied. Zara entered with her usual efficiency, mentally cataloging equipment specifications while two guards maintained close proximity. The explosion that brought down the warehouse's eastern wall was precisely calculated to separate her from the security team without killing anyone immediately. Lee Sangmin needed her alive and functional, understanding that a dead hostage provided no leverage over someone like June. The blast created enough chaos for his operators to isolate and extract her, while her protectors struggled with structural collapse and smoke that obscured visibility. When consciousness returned, Zara found herself in a sterile room that might have been a medical facility under different circumstances. Clean white walls, metal fixtures, and equipment that suggested her captors had done extensive research into effective interrogation techniques. Lee Sangmin sat across from her with the patient confidence of someone who held all available advantages. "Dr. Zara Williams," he said pleasantly, using her former name with deliberate precision. Or should I say, the woman who has become June Hyenwood's greatest weakness. The next several hours tested every principle she developed about medical ethics and human dignity. Lee's interrogation focused not on extracting information about June's business operations, but on understanding the psychological dynamics that made her valuable to him. What secrets did she keep about his vulnerabilities? How could his obsession with her protection be weaponized? What would he sacrifice to ensure her safety? She endured each question with the same stubborn silence she'd maintained during medical board investigations, understanding that cooperation would not improve her situation, but would provide weapons to use against the man who'd offered her sanctuary when she had nowhere else to turn. When Lee's patience finally frayed into threats of physical harm, she met his anger with clinical detachment that infuriated him more than defiance would have. "You think he will come for you?" Lee observed during a brief respite from his questioning. "You believe his protection extends beyond mere convenience." "I know he will," she replied with absolute certainty, surprising herself with how completely she trusted June's promise of protection. Meanwhile, June's response to her kidnapping revealed depths of lethal capability that his usual controlled demeanor had only hinted at. The man who conducted business with quiet authority transformed into something primal and unstoppable, mobilizing resources that demonstrated why his enemies had learned to fear him rather than simply respect his power. Within hours, every intelligence asset he controlled focused on locating Lee's facilities. Financial networks froze accounts, supply chains shut down operations, and carefully cultivated relationships with law enforcement suddenly became active partnerships. The measured businessman disappeared, replaced by someone whose reputation had been built on the absolute certainty that crossing him carried consequences beyond simple retaliation. The assault on Lee's warehouse stronghold was surgical in its precision and devastating in its execution. June's operators moved through the facility like a force of nature, neutralizing resistance with efficiency that spoke of extensive training and complete commitment to their objective. He led the advance team personally, his usual preference for operating through intermediaries abandoned in favor of direct action. When he found Zara in the interrogation room, her first words were not about her own condition, but about his safety. "You should not have come yourself," she said, noting the tactical gear he wore and the weapons his team carried. The risk was too great. The concern in her voice, expressed even while she remained restrained and clearly injured, broke through his controlled facade entirely. In that moment, Lee Sangmin realized he had fundamentally miscalculated the nature of what bound these two people together. This was not mere obsession or convenient arrangement, but something that made them willing to sacrifice everything for each other's welfare. June's handling of Lee was swift and final, carried out with the cold efficiency that had made him legendary among people who understood the true cost of power. But Zara noted that even in executing justice, he remained controlled rather than cruel, focused on eliminating threat rather than satisfying revenge. The drive back to the compound passed in silence, punctuated only by her professional assessment of his team's injuries and his careful monitoring of her condition. She had sustained bruising and minor lacerations, but nothing requiring immediate medical intervention, though he insisted on carrying her from the vehicle to her suite despite her protest that she was capable of walking. As he settled her onto the medical examination table sheet had installed at her rooms, their eyes met with understanding that transcended the physical relief of reunion. The crisis had forced them both to confront feelings that had been building since their first night together, emotions that could no longer be disguised as simple mutual necessity. "You came for me," she said quietly, the statement carrying layers of meaning beyond mere acknowledgement of rescue. "I will always come for you," he replied with intensity that made her pulse quicken. "There is nowhere you could be taken that I would not follow, no price I would not pay to bring you home." The word home resonated between them with significance neither had previously acknowledged. The compound had transformed from temporary sanctuary into something deeper, a place where they belonged together rather than simply coexisted for mutual benefit. That night, as she treated the minor injuries his team had sustained during the rescue operation, Zara realized that her feelings for June had evolved far beyond gratitude or physical attraction into something that felt dangerously close to love. The revelation should have terrified her, but instead brought a sense of rightness that surprised her with its clarity. When the last patient had been treated and her medical responsibilities satisfied, she found June waiting in her sitting area with the patient intensity she'd learned meant he was processing complex emotions. The careful control he maintained during business operations had been stripped away by the day's events, leaving him as vulnerable as she'd ever seen him. "I cannot lose you," he said simply, the words carrying weight that made her understand how completely their lives had become intertwined. "You will not lose me," she replied with certainty that surprised them both. "I'm not going anywhere, June. This is where I choose to be." The declaration represented more than acceptance of their arrangement or acknowledgement of mutual attraction. It was recognition that what had begun as forced proximity had become genuine partnership, that protection had evolved into devotion, and that both of them had found something worth fighting for in each other. As they sat together in the quiet aftermath of crisis, Zara understood that Lee Song-min's attack had accomplished the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than exposing weakness that could be exploited, it had revealed the strength that came from choosing to care for someone completely, from building something worth defending together, rather than simply coexisting in parallel isolation. 3 weeks after Lee Song-min's organization was dismantled, the legal documents that had haunted Zara's nightmares arrived via certified courier. The Georgia State Medical Board's final determination, delivered in language as formal as it was life-changing. All charges dismissed, license fully reinstated, record expunged of all references to malpractice allegations. Her former colleague's testimony, combined with new evidence that had somehow surfaced during the investigation, had vindicated her completely. The accompanying letter from her former attorney explained the sudden reversal in fortune. Key witnesses had been located and provided testimony that supported her version of events. Financial resources had mysteriously become available for a proper defense. Most importantly, the family who had sued her had withdrawn their complaint entirely after reaching an undisclosed settlement that left both parties satisfied. June's involvement in resolving her legal troubles was neither mentioned nor denied, but his quiet satisfaction when she showed him the documents confirmed what she'd suspected. His influence had reached across the country to dismantle the case that had destroyed her career, giving her back not just her medical license, but her freedom to choose any future she desired. "You could return to Atlanta tomorrow," he observed, watching her read through the reinstatement papers with careful neutrality. "Resume the career that was taken from you." "I could," she agreed, setting the documents aside to study his expression. "Is that what you want me to do?" The question hung between them with weight that transcended simple logistics. With her legal troubles resolved and Lee's threat eliminated, the original justification for their arrangement had disappeared entirely. She possessed complete freedom to leave, to reclaim her former life, to walk away from the compound and everything it represented. The cage he'd offered had transformed into an open door. "What I want," he said carefully, "is for you to have the choice you were denied 3 years ago." That evening, she found him in his private garden, a space where he retreated when business pressures demanded solitude. The setting sun cast long shadows across carefully tended plants that spoke of someone who understood beauty as well as power. He sat on a stone bench with the stillness she'd learned indicated deep contemplation rather than simple rest. "Tell me about your family," she said, settling beside him with the comfortable familiarity that had developed through shared crisis and mutual trust. The story emerged slowly, painted in details that revealed the boy he'd been before violence, transformed him into the man who commanded through fear and respect. Parents who'd built a small import business through honest work. A sister who dreamed of becoming a teacher. Grandparents who'd fled North Korea to build new lives in the South, only to lose everything to the same type of corruption they'd escaped. After they died, I convinced myself that the only way to honor their memory was to become powerful enough to prevent anyone from taking what belonged to me ever again, he said quietly. I built an organization based on absolute control, because control seemed like the only antidote to helplessness. "And now?" she asked, sensing the shift in his perspective that recent events had catalyzed. "Now I understand that true security does not come from controlling everything, but from finding someone worth being vulnerable with," he replied, meeting her eyes with honesty that made her chest tighten. "You showed me that strength can coexist with compassion, that protecting someone means preserving their ability to choose rather than eliminating their alternatives." The confession represented more than personal growth. It revealed the fundamental transformation their relationship had worked in both of them. She had learned to accept protection without sacrificing autonomy, while he had discovered that real power came from inspiring loyalty rather than demanding submission. "I have a proposal to make," he continued, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a folder that clearly contained legal documents. "Not as your protector, but as someone who has fallen completely in love with a woman who saved his life and taught him what it means to be human again." The partnership agreement was unlike anything she'd expected. Equal status in a reformed organization focused on legitimate business ventures and community protection. Full authority over all medical operations, with budget and personnel decisions under her complete control. Most importantly, the power to restructure their activities to align with her ethical standards rather than simply accommodating them. "You are offering me a position as your business partner," she said, processing the scope of what he was proposing. "I'm offering you everything I have, everything I am, and everything I can become with you beside me," he corrected gently. "The business partnership is simply the legal framework for what I truly want to give you." He moved from the bench to kneel beside her, his vulnerability in that position more powerful than any declaration could have been. The man who commanded through presence and authority had literally placed himself at her feet, offering not just his heart, but his complete trust in her response. "Marry me, Zara, not because circumstances force us together, but because I cannot imagine a future worth having that does not include you as my equal partner in everything we build together." The proposal was not a surprise, but the emotion behind it overwhelmed her with its intensity. This was not the controlled businessman making a strategic alliance, but the man who'd shown her his scars and trusted her with his deepest vulnerabilities, asking her to share a lifetime of building something beautiful together. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying 3 years of finding her way back to herself, and the promise of decades spent creating something larger than either could achieve alone. The wedding ceremony 3 months later reflected the fusion of their backgrounds and a future they intended to build together. Traditional Korean elements honored his family's memory, while African American customs celebrated her heritage and the community that had shaped her compassion. The guest list included former patients she'd treated, members of his organization who'd learned to respect her authority, and colleagues from both their worlds who witnessed the transformation love had worked in two people who'd found healing in each other. The compound itself underwent dramatic changes as their partnership reshaped the organization's priorities. The medical facility expanded into a community clinic serving families who couldn't afford traditional health care, with Zara leading a team of physicians who provided services regardless of patient ability to pay. June's business operations shifted toward legitimate investments and community development, using his influence to improve rather than simply control their environment. The most profound change came in how they approached power itself. Rather than hoarding authority to prevent loss, they used their combined influence to create stability that benefited everyone in their sphere. Zara's medical expertise and ethical standards balanced June's strategic thinking and resource management, creating an organization that generated respect through service rather than fear through dominance. 6 months after their wedding, Zara stood in her expanded medical facility, reviewing treatment statistics that demonstrated the impact their partnership had achieved. Infant mortality rates in their district had dropped by 30%. Preventable diseases had been virtually eliminated through vaccination programs she'd implemented. Emergency response times had improved dramatically through training programs that taught basic medical skills to security personnel. June appeared beside her with a quiet presence she'd learned to anticipate, his review of financial reports showing similar success in their legitimate business ventures. The combination of her medical insights and his strategic planning had created profitable enterprises that strengthened their community rather than exploiting its vulnerabilities. "Norigrits?" he asked, studying her face with the careful attention he'd always paid to her emotional state. "Only that it took so long for us to find each other," she replied, leaning into the warmth of his presence with complete contentment. As they reviewed the day's reports together, Zara reflected on the journey that had brought them from collision through crisis to this moment of shared purpose. The woman who'd once hidden her medical skills while serving tables had become the chief medical officer of an organization dedicated to protecting and healing their community. The man who'd controlled through fear had learned to lead through inspiration, using his power to create rather than simply maintain. Their love story had become something larger than personal happiness, transforming into a partnership that made their corner of the world safer for everyone who lived there. Whether you're watching this from your own corner of the world, in Seoul, Atlanta, or anywhere in between, you understand that sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones where two broken people help each other heal while making everything around them stronger. That evening, as they walked through neighborhoods where children played safely and families gathered without fear, Zara understood that their collision in that restaurant had created ripple effects that extended far beyond their personal transformation. They had built something together that honored both their wounded pasts and their shared commitment to preventing others from experiencing unnecessary loss. The compound that had once been a fortress designed to keep threats out had become a sanctuary that welcomed anyone seeking healing or hope. The medical clinic operated around the clock, staffed by physicians who'd chosen to join their mission of providing care regardless of political or financial considerations. Community programs funded through their business ventures offered education, job training, and support services that addressed root causes of desperation rather than simply responding to its symptoms. As they reached their private garden where he'd first proposed, June pulled her close with the gentle possession that had replaced his earlier need for control. In his embrace, she felt not the weight of captivity, but the strength that came from choosing to build a life with someone who understood that true power meant creating safety for others rather than simply securing it for themselves. Their future stretched ahead with possibilities neither had imagined when circumstances first forced them together. Children to raise with values that honored both their cultures. A legacy of healing and protection that would outlast their individual lives. The certainty that whatever challenges arose, They would face them as equal partners committed to preserving what they'd built together. In the distance, the lights of the city sparkled with promise, each one representing lives their partnership had touched and futures made brighter by their combined commitment to turning strength into service, protection into healing, and love into something that transformed not just themselves, but everyone fortunate enough to witness what they'd created together.